environment. And that's unfortunate because that sort of set a model, I think, that a lot of other countries have adopted. And coastal zone management has been defined primarily, again, somebody might disagree, but primarily as a terrestrial planning activity. That's where the authority exists for most of the regulation of activities that occur in coastal areas. So the marine environment, with a few exceptions, Oregon and a couple of other places, was basically not considered as integral part of the coastal zone management process. As I said, that was transferred to a lot of other places. I haven't found many countries in the world where they define coastal management as anything marine. It's hard enough to find these examples of the marine. And I'm talking about, I'm not talking about a little narrow. There are a lot of communities that do planning out to 500 feet or maybe a mile or 3 miles. They're really brave. But nobody goes beyond that because they don't have any jurisdiction over that in many places. So because of this lack of thought of planning the marine environment, we explicitly we took the approach of saying, rather than stand at the coast and sort of say, how far out can we go? We're going to stand out at the EEZ and find out who's actually doing any planning in terms of this connection between land and the marine environment. So we really wanted to focus on the marine environment, and we're guilty. Almost all of our examples are marine without much consideration of what has happened in terms of the interface between coastal areas and the marine environment. Critical question. We just wanted to get people excited about the marine environment and know and be able to illustrate that you in fact can do planning in that environment as well. Obviously there's a connection between not only coastal management but land use management, water resource management, etc. I tried to illustrate that in one of my slides, and we have to figure out that as well. But to make this a more tractable problem, we focused only on marine areas. And in fact, in most of these cases, Germany an exception, the United States an exception, the national government has authority over that area. So it's a sort of a top-down process, which is another criticism of us. We really haven't looked at sort of bottom-up kinds of planning processes that may in fact be doing a good job on the environment. And one of the best examples I can think of in terms of this bottoms-up planning and thinking about marine planning is done right here by coastal First Nations. I mean, I've been looking at what has been done. I think it's great. I mean, it's really good. And I think it's a good example of, community level planning that is going to bubble up and have an effect on what's going on in a bigger region. There aren't many other examples. Well, again, I'm sure you would disagree with that because you obviously have something in mind, but there aren't that many examples, particularly around the world. Maybe here in Canada there are. But another example of community level planning that has basically been, I don't want to say dismissed, but discounted now is Sweden. Sweden is just getting started on marine spatial planning. They had a national inquiry about the benefits of spatial planning. You can find it on our website. They came to the conclusion that they're tackling spatial marine management or planning in the wrong way in Sweden because they did it all at the community level. It's been done for hundreds of years at the community level in Sweden. There are 500 marine plans in Sweden. It's an awfully big coastline as well. And the sum of those 500 plans didn't add up to 501. It was just individual communities, mostly ports, fishing ports, a few marine transportation ports, but mostly fishing. They were doing land use plans and marine plans as well because they would go out to 500 meters or 500 feet from the shoreline, but that was it. And so they said, we can't do planning like this anymore. We've got to do planning at a bigger scale to deal with the processes that we're trying to look at that might affect human activities or vice versa. So they've set up a system where they're going to do regional plans and a national plan that is sort of the nested kind of approach, include the local plans to the extent that they're relevant to what they're trying to do, but not start there and think that that was going to take care of all of Sweden.
My name is Henry Kuchera. I'm from an organization called PACMARA. And your statement earlier was interesting about the petroleum, phone up the president, I need a little bit more leeway here. I started my environmental planning role years ago in Alberta. And in Alberta, they established something called the Energy Resource Conservation Board to do integrated resource planning. And it's actually an example of you can do integrated resource planning and leave out nature, because that's what happened. until probably 4 years in, and nature was brought in. But the interesting thing about that was there was no way for anybody, once that was established at a provincial level, to go around and change the rules. And I wonder if there's any comment you'd like to make, if there's some merit to doing something like they did in Massachusetts, where you do your planning based on a regional authority that's completely set up separately that may have all of your jurisdictions involved. That's what happened with the ERCB in Alberta, where all of the different types of energy extraction had to participate. They had to put in money. They had to put in staff. Right. All the government bodies had to put staff into this agency to staff it up, guaranteeing the funding, and it had some perpetuity to it. Right. Is there any merit in that, possibly?
Absolutely. I mean, I'm a very pragmatic person when it comes to planning and getting things done. And if it meets goals and objectives of the planning area, whatever that management unit is, that's great. There's no one prescription for doing this. And again, I wanted to make that point. And if anyone looks at our guide to marine spatial planning, at one time we were calling these guidelines, which is a very bad term, particularly in a lot of other parts of the world, because we would go and sort of say what we were doing, and somebody in the audience would stand up and say, tell me the GIS system that I should use to do all of the things that you're talking about. And we said, wait a minute, that's not what we're talking about. So we got away from guidelines and said, this is just a general guide. And in fact, it's quite flexible, and the institutional arrangements that are used to get things done, I think, are also highly variable and flexible and adaptive, and whatever works in a particular context is great. Let me tell you an example of Germany, which has they have two shorelines. They've got a Baltic Sea area and they've got a North Sea area. And you can ask Jeff Ardern about this one because he's had firsthand experience. Germany had a debate about what federal agency should actually carry out their marine spatial plan. What they had done in Germany was, I think I mentioned, they extended their land use legislation all the way out to the EEZ. So it was very strong legislation, but they didn't prescribe in the legislation who should do it. So there was an internal debate between the department that was, I think, in the Department of Transportation, and they were actually the hydrography, charting, and marine transportation guys. They were debating with the Ministry of Natural Environment, which also had an oceans part of it, and they had already established under Natura 2000, I think something close to 30% of the German EEZ as biologically important areas, and most of them had been designated as marine protected areas. So they said, well, wait a minute, we should be doing the marine plan. Well, they lost the debate, and it was given to the mapping people, the marine transportation. Guess what the plan looks like? Look at the German plan. The German plan is nice and precise. It's got all the marine transportation routes laid out. That was the basis of the plan. They take existing routes, and that was going to be the structure. They had to fit in wind farms in that structure, and so they took the wind farms out of away from the marine transportation routes. And all of these nature protection sites that had been designated by the other ministry were basically considered, quote unquote, but not part of the final plan. So if you look at the German plan and go to our website and look at that, or you can actually download the whole document, you'll find maps that have a very faint green blob in the background of these very strong transportation routes and wind farm locations, and those are the protected areas, quote unquote, and you'll see transportation routes running right through them. I mean, they basically ignored that process. So here was a strong authority and an agency that had capability to do mapping, but they could care less about the nature conservation aspects of their plan. They had a big debate in the German government. Finally, the environmental people were told to shut up and go back to Wilm or wherever they were, and the plan is now pretty much final, and it doesn't do a whole lot of consideration of nature conservation. So that's a theoretically strong institutional arrangement that produced pretty bad result as far as integrated management.